When George Lucas created the original Star Wars movie, he made a clear dynamic of the Galactic Civil War depicted. In just the opening scene, we gain an understanding of what kind of conflict it is between the rebels, who were a small group of underdog freedom fighters, and the Empire, which stood as a large, militarized, and industrialized powerhouse. This was shown both through the size difference of the Rebel blockade runner versus the Imperial Star Destroyer, as well as how outnumbered and outgunned the Rebel soldiers were in comparison to the Stormtroopers. As the film goes on, we gain a greater understanding of what the Empire is. They stood as an authoritarian superpower which predominantly exercised control through fear, while gradually waning away the democracy that it once stood as. This was showcased mainly through their soldiers' dehumanized appearance, their harsh treatment of captured rebels, the torture of POWs, maintaining a military presence even in dust balls as far and remote as Tatooine, burning potential rebel sympathizers, and use of the Death Star against an entire planet just to make a galactic demonstration. Their general attitude of exercising control was even further emphasized in the conference room scenes, which got into the priority of some of the Empire's most influential members. Following the success of the original film, the Empire would further be expanded upon in both Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. The former would expand on the Empire's iron grip, showcasing the fear members like Vader generated not only against enemies and outsiders, but even against their own officers, showing how cutthroat their system was. It also introduced the Emperor, who, as far as we knew at the time, was a mysterious ruler over the regime. The latter movie got into greater detail through putting the Emperor on the forefront, establishing that the Empire was not just a tyrannical, cold and ruthless regime, reflective of totalitarian regimes of our world such as the Third Reich, the Soviet Union, or the Roman Empire, but that they were literally the instrument of a Dark Lord in his horrific designs. From every metric, the Empire was an embodiment of evil. However, ever since the existence of the prequel trilogy in the external lore, we learned that there may be more to the story than meets the eye. After all, the Empire was a legal change from the Republic, and its rise came from the applause of the people. We also know from our last analysis that the Republic was far from a perfect government, with its corruption and inefficiency bringing thousands of star systems to feel neglected and exploited. Just as the Separatists was one response to the Republic's political, economic, and moral decay, the formation of the Empire served as another, albeit drastically different attempt to solve the galactic problems that were present. As such, could an argument be made that the Empire did act as a force of good and that the galaxy was made better through them? Now, to be clear, I am in no way using this analysis as an attempt to diss George's intentions behind the creation of this faction, as it was clear that the Empire made up the villain role in the original trilogy. All this analysis shall serve as is to find one answer within lore. Is the Empire truly evil at its core, or are there redeeming qualities within the regime? Let's find out. Unlike the Republic that preceded it, the Galactic Empire was founded at a very fixed point in time for a very fixed set of reasons. Formed at the end of the Clone Wars, the Galactic Empire stood on the ideals of bringing order and unity to the galaxy following the previous divide and ravaged state most of its planets fell into following the war. During the initial years, the Empire built its policies largely similar to the Republic's late wartime policies, with its earliest laws merely making Palpatine's emergency powers as Chancellor permanent as Emperor. The Empire also benefited from inheriting the assets and political structure of the Republic before it. Their early reign was met with relatively little change in conception. The Emperor was initially viewed as little different than the Chancellor outside of holding office for life. The Imperial Senate was merely a continuation of the Galactic Senate, and the military was largely under the control of veterans of the Clone Wars, with frontline soldiers being the Clone Army. However, In spite of its surface similarities to the Republic of old, the Empire did not stand for the same set of ideals, and in some ways stood in direct contrast to them. This was best displayed in their titles during the Dark Times era, with the Republic being referred to as the Old Order, while the Empire was referred to as the New Order. Its ideals promoted a rejection of the Republic's decentralization, division of power, adherence to democratic principles, and equality that the Republic previously stood for. Instead, the Empire made the foundation of its beliefs based on needing to speak and act under a single sovereign authority, an authority that would carry as much centralized power as possible in order to keep its population ideologically unified, as well as crush any dissent. This is best summarized by Emperor Palpatine during the declaration of the New Order, to quote the important section, "Never again will we be divided. Never again will sector turn against sector, planet turn against planet, sibling turn against sibling. We are one nation, indivisible, to ensure that we will always stand together, that we will always speak with a single voice and act with a single hand. The Republic must change. We must evolve. We must grow. We have become an empire, in fact. Let us become an empire in name as well. We are the first Galactic Empire. We are an empire that will continue to be ruled by this august body. We are an empire that will never return to the political maneuvering and corruption that has wounded us so deeply. We are an empire that will be directed by a single sovereign, chosen for life. We are an empire ruled by the majority, an empire ruled by a new constitution, an empire of laws, not politicians, an empire devoted to the preservation of a just society, of a safe and secure society. We are an empire that will stand for 10,000 years. Imperial ideals at their absolute core were rooted as a response not only to the Republic's previous problems, but the Clone Wars itself. In many ways, it served as the most radical reform the Republic could have done. However, these reforms were not rooted in simply altering execution of the Republic's principles, but rather changing the principles altogether. While the Republic tolerated a diversity of beliefs, even those contrary to their own principles and stances, the Empire didn't. Instead, Imperial ideals promoted the belief that unless a strong central authority maintained control and took firm action in putting down defiant action, another Clone Wars would inevitably repeat itself. The Empire also rejected the concept of equality among the people in favor of a top-down hierarchy which was factored in the Empire's political, economic, military, and social systems. Beginning politically, the Empire had the Galactic Emperor as the highest executive ruler over the government. Initially, the Empire's governing authority was mostly controlled, at least in theory, by the Imperial Senate, which simply operated as a continuation of the Republic Senate. Much like the Galactic Senate, the Imperial Senate decided on official Imperial law and was composed of senators representing individual star systems with a variety of planetary governments. However, unlike the Republic, which only moderately placed central authority above planetary authority, the Empire made abundantly clear that no customs, traditions, or planetary rights would trump over the Empire's proclaimed interests, with planets like Naboo representing an example of the Empire's willingness to even overthrow planetary governments that don't easily conform to the Imperial state. This course of action only became more common when political power of the Imperial Senate was further waning in favor of the Imperial Council of Moffs. Moffs were military officials that were assigned political roles, mainly in overseeing control of star systems and sectors for the Imperial military. While they did initially operate as a simple wartime role the Republic had at the tail end of the Clone Wars, their power expanded immensely during the rule of the Empire, leading them to begin eclipsing the Imperial Senate in directing Imperial policy, including economics. Economically speaking, the Empire maintained a capitalist mode of production, though unlike the Republic, did not promote a free market. Instead, it operated much closer to a corporatist economy, with an emphasis on state involvement in the private sector. Its earliest involvement was in nationalization of many megacorporations, most common being ones that supported the CIS during the Clone Wars. Companies like the Trade Federation, Techno Union, Commerce Guild, and Corporate Alliance saw their companies absorbed and their assets liquidated. Others, like the Intergalactic Banking Clan, were spared from nationalization, but were subject to heavy Imperial regulations and oversight. The next and somewhat contradictory action was reprivatization of company assets towards loyalist companies. In fact, loyalist corporations that remained on the side of the Galactic Republic during the Clone Wars saw their economic influence reach an all-time high during the Empire's rule. This was because the Empire would rely heavily on these companies for expanding the Imperial war machine. This led to an almost perfect merger of state and corporate power, which was showcased in the expansion of the corporate sector up to over 30,000 planets. These corporate powers were also expanded because of the Empire's defunding of social services it previously provided as the Republic, instead believing that the wealth would be better allocated towards the Imperial military, Imperial science, and investments into resource-rich worlds. Another contrast from the Republic was the Empire's persecution against trade unions, preventing dissent against corporations that aligned with Imperial interests. It is worth noting that while this blend of state and corporate power was tolerated and even encouraged by Imperial policy, such measures were a means to an end, and the Empire gradually took more direct control over the galactic economy, leading into and during the Galactic Civil War. This question is difficult to answer, primarily because what Imperial idealists wanted and what the Empire's most influential leaders wanted were two separate things. Beginning with the former, the official goals of the Galactic Empire was working to create a society that would be purged from endless corruption, division, and war. One measure that was taken to accomplish this was through integrating the military into civilian life. Unlike the Republic during the Ruusan Reformation, the Empire was not keen on simply relying on decentralized militias nor small judiciary forces to protect their territory as well as enforce laws. Nor was it set on using primarily artificial armies either like the Republic and Separatists did during the Clone Wars. Instead, their military would be large, vast, and nearly entirely composed of civilian populations from Imperial worlds. This decision was carried out for a large variety of reasons. One, the cost of the clone army it inherited became too costly to sustain. During the beginning of the Dark Times era, the clone army operated quite well in enforcing Imperial rule through the partaking in the Jedi Purge, engaging against Separatist holdouts, protecting Imperial borders, and presenting a strong image of victory following the Clone Wars. However, as more of these factors began to fade, the need for the clone army also began to fade. This was only made worse for the Empire when sizable factions of clones began defecting and taking arms against the government. By extension, a droid army would not be viable to the Empire either, because of battle droids' previous association with the Confederacy, as well as the current association with Separatist holdouts, causing a major propaganda danger if done. 2. The Empire saw civilian recruitment as a means to deter insurrection. After all, people would be less likely to rebel against the Empire if they are part of it or in relation to someone who is part of the Imperial military, with their livelihood having a direct tie towards the Empire itself. This benefit also added to the solution for civilians who needed economic recovery following the Clone Wars, as the Imperial military would offer a chance for a better life. Finally, the integration of citizens into the Imperial military was directly tied into the ideology itself. New Order ideals promoted that most of the galaxy's problems could be solved through assertive action. That assertive action was made both more believable and more acceptable when soldiers of the Galactic Empire were composed of people who held belief in the Empire's cause. It led to the image that New Order ideals must hold some merit for so many to be willing to fight for it. These principles were only further ingrained into Imperial citizens, in no small part thanks to the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, or COP-NOR for short. COP-NOR was a continuation of the Commission for the Protection of the Republic, or COMPOR for short, and operated to spread and ingrain Imperial ideals across the entire populace. Unlike other topic points, however, COP-NOR was not part of the Imperial government or military in an official sense, though they amassed so much influence in the Empire that their political power would often eclipse that of the Imperial senators and moffs. Their power also extended in convincing the populace that the Empire's existence and actions stood as an improvement over the Republic's chaos, corruption, and elitism. All of these core factors ultimately contributed to the Empire's leading objective, or at least its claimed objective: order. Order was the word constantly utilized as the summary of their ideals, whether that be order in galactic security in preventing future large-scale wars, order in the military hierarchy built on rigid and absolute authority, order in politics by centralizing its government under a single man and branch, or order in thought, suppressing notions of individualism and nonconformity in favor of unity and obedience. What Imperial idealists wanted came down to creating a galaxy where its mechanisms would be made to work collectively for the betterment of society as a whole. Of course, what Imperial idealists wanted in an official sense was not the same as what the actual leadership wanted in practice. While one side of the Empire made up its set of idealists, the other side contained some of the most power-hungry, petty, self-centered, and vile men and women in galactic history. Because of Emperor Palpatine's grand impact on the galaxy and his presence as a Sith being factored in a separate section, he shall be circled back to later in this analysis. However, the political leadership of the Galactic Empire goes beyond just the Emperor, in spite of his unquestionable place at the top of the Imperial hierarchy. Where the Empire had its greatest wide influence was within the Imperial Moffs. Imperial Moffs were selected to oversee entire star systems and even sectors. Their goals for the Empire were much more simple and also much more despicable. To the overwhelming majority of Moffs, the Empire was a means to acquire greater power and influence for themselves. Their control over sectors were so immense that the only being these Moffs were accountable to were those of high rank in the Imperial hierarchy such as Grand Moffs, with them only being accountable to the Emperor himself. While bodies like the Imperial Senate were able to keep the Moffs on a leash for a time, the further the Empire centralized its control with time and depended more on its government and military, the less power even the Imperial Senate had to deal with it. And by the time the Imperial Senate was dissolved in 0 BBY, these Moffs effectively became the second most powerful ruling class of the Empire outside the Emperor. However, even that was not enough. Most of these Moffs were power-hungry and ambitious, wanting to expand even more control over the Empire than they already had. This problem became so thorough that a tactic used by the Rebel Alliance and New Republic alike was to attack one Imperial sector under the control of one Moff and draw their fleet into another sector under the control of a different Moff, which would lead to political tensions at best and downright crossfire battles at worst, with the Imperial forces under each Moff fighting against each other. While Imperial idealists saw the word order as wanting to build a unified and stable galaxy, the Moffs saw the word order as wanting to cement control over the galaxy. One subscribed to peace through authority, while the other subscribed to power through tyranny. Unfortunately for the idealists, the Moffs won out in the ideological struggle, in no small part thanks to the Emperor himself. However, How did these mechanisms affect daily life under the Empire? Quality of life in the Galactic Empire is difficult to assess primarily because it varied greatly depending on three major factors: where in the galaxy you were from, what kind of wealth you possessed, and what species you were. As mentioned before, the Empire rejected the ideals of Republic equality in favor of beliefs in hierarchy. However, that hierarchy did not just exist within its politics and military. It existed in its social conditions as well. Breaking through each aspect of Imperial discrimination, the Empire largely maintained core world supremacy over the Rim sectors, with the Outer Rim especially facing major bigotry because of their inferior development, predominance of alien species, and for many worlds previous associations with the Confederacy of Independent Systems. In fact, in spite of the Empire's claim of an unbiased unity, the divide between the core and Rim was even higher than it was under the Galactic Republic. This developed into elitist sentiments becoming more common than ever before. This was most predominantly reflected in the Imperial military, as when the Empire further progressed, high-ranking generals, admirals, and especially Moffs were determined less by their actual skill and more from their political connections and social alignment towards Imperial narratives, leading to an overwhelming majority of high-ranking officials being from the core worlds. Meanwhile, the only real chance an Outer Rim world had in being somewhat valued by the Galactic Empire was enlisting into the Imperial Army, Navy, or Stormtrooper Corps. However, climbing the ranks of the Empire was in many ways a suicide run in and of itself, primarily because of the cutthroat attitude among Imperial leaders and because the Empire's extremely low tolerance of failure, leading to members being unwilling to take risks for the benefit of the Empire and to throw someone else under the speeder for any shortcomings. The second area of Imperial discrimination was based on degree of wealth. As covered earlier, while many megacorporations, specifically those who supported the Separatists, were nationalized and carved up by the Empire, just as many megacorporations were empowered by the Empire and integrated into the Empire's social hierarchy. Unlike the Republic, which viewed the wealthy more or less neutrally despite the influence they held and corruption they promoted, the Empire viewed an accumulation of wealth through supporting their military-industrial complex to be an innate good in Imperial society, and as such, individuals that achieved this were held to higher value compared to Imperials who couldn't or wouldn't use whatever means necessary to amass wealth and strengthen the Empire's industrial might. An example of the Empire having this attitude was through the crushing of trade unions that resisted the aligned megacorporations, the removal of many worker protection laws, and through the legalization of barbaric practices such as slavery. While the topic of slavery will largely tie into the third field of Imperial discrimination, it is important to note how slavery's inclusion did provide a great deal of benefits towards Imperial-aligned companies and the Imperial war machine itself. The Imperials also more than capitalized on the fact that slavery was an effective means in providing cheap labor for their secret projects, and for removing problematic members from Imperial society. Speaking of, the third aspect of Imperial discrimination, and the one that most dominantly influenced the Empire's social condition, was its speciesism against alien races. Beginning at the top, Emperor Palpatine himself was not notably a speciesist, and even held some degree of value in Imperial assets regardless of what species they were. However, he did see speciesism as a useful tool in creating a divisive hierarchy that could more or less be easily ruled over. That being said, Palpatine surrounded himself with advisors, political officials, and military leaders who were predominantly speciesist. As a result, the Empire's policies were enforced with a human-centric agenda where humans were provided the most benefits through Imperial rule, while the average alien species was treated as second-class citizens. Typically, the way an alien in the Empire was treated was largely based on how close to human they were. If they were not human but still humanoid, i.e. maintained the physical traits found in humans, they would be treated as only marginally inferior in the hierarchy than humans. Yes, they would be constantly reminded of their inferiority towards humans, but so long as they followed Imperial law and proved useful, they would still be treated with some degree of dignity. However, alien species that were not humanoid were massively discriminated against to the point of stripping them of basic sentient rights. This was most prominent with the Wookiees and the Geonosians. The former were demonized in Imperial propaganda to be viewed as little more than unruly beasts, and using it as justification to enslave them for Imperial projects. This also was used as justification to pacify their planets through invasion. The tragic irony being how Kashyyyk was allied with the Republic during the Clone Wars, only to later face invasion by the Empire itself. Other species, such as the Mon Calamari, faced similar treatment. By contrast, unless a punishment for a crime, it was illegal under the Empire for humans to be enslaved. In fact, many of the conquests in the Outer Rim were justified by the Empire under the principle of eliminating alien slavers. However, even species that were enslaved by the Empire had it easy compared to the Geonosians. The Geonosians not only had their rights stripped by the Empire due to basic beliefs of inferiority, but they also were never intended to survive the reign of the Empire due to their previous alignment with the Confederacy of Independent Systems. As a result, the Empire made use of the Geonosians for their engineering skills as slaves for the Death Star's construction, before eventually committing genocide against the species to cover up the work done. In fact, the Empire had an entire subsection that was created just for the purpose of genocide against alien species that were deemed problematic by the Imperial government. This was known as the Imperial Department of Redesign. To add to this, mistreatment of alien species under the Galactic Empire was not just physical. During the early years of its reign, the Empire took a major effort in rewriting history to undermine alien contributions to galactic civilization in order to paint humanity as the sole drivers of civilization, innovation, and moral progress. Almost all alien civilizations and empires were removed from the Empire's history, promoting the notion that non-humans were not capable of building stable societies. The sole exception to this was the Hutts, as their control and reach was so vast that not even the Empire would be able to fabricate a false narrative about them. Because of the Empire's anti-alien agenda being mostly gradual, it allowed even moderate human centrists or even ignorant Imperials to justify this speciest rhetoric as a simple acknowledgement of factual differences between humans and alien species, making them not speciesists but realists. Of course, the ramifications of the Empire's speciesism is that it created a civilization not based on unity, hierarchy of merit, or firm and fair order, but one rooted in divide, mistrust, and moral bankruptcy. While it is true that some of these destructive policies were first seen during the era of the Galactic Republic, such as the Ecological Act, which permitted the extermination of dangerous non-sentient species, the Empire took what was previously a rational yet flawed policy to such an extreme that it generated fear within non-humans that their tolerance within the Empire would one day expire. These fears were only validated by high-ranking Imperials such as Grand Admiral Pita, who initiated an Imperial campaign across the Outer Rim and depopulated entire worlds based on their alien origin and nothing else. As a result of Imperial persecution reaching the kind of scale that it did, thousands of aliens were flocking to the rebellion's ranks simply on the ground of self-preservation. From everything that is seen here, it would likely leave you to question how the Empire could allow itself to reach such a monstrous state even when it served as a direct successor to the Galactic Republic, and were composed of the same kind of populace, politicians, and military officials. After all, While the Republic was corrupt and in moral decline, as we covered in our last analysis, it never allowed itself to reach such satanic levels of evil. The Republic may have had a good possibility of becoming an authoritarian and imperialist society on its own anyways, but there was one last piece to the puzzle for why the Empire turned out the way it did. What truly separated the Galactic Empire from previous governments, such as the Galactic Republic or even the Confederacy of Independent Systems, was its root being ingrained in Sith ideology. After all, take away the fancy claims of legitimacy by the Imperial Senate or the complex systems of the military, and the Empire was simply the realization of the Sith Grand Plan. While the Empire did not openly proclaim ideological ties towards the Sith, its control by the Sith was total and absolute. Average Imperials were not aware of this. However, there is no doubt that Imperial ideology was directly inspired from Sith ideology. Of course, there were clear differences. Sith did not particularly have a value in human high culture. In fact, most species Sith were composed of Sith purebloods who saw other species, including humans, as inferior. The Sith did not also have much value in Imperial ideal structures such as obedience, authority, and order, unless they were at the top of such structures. However, they did share common similarities through both their projections of ruling and their pursuit of power. Sith ideology promoted the notion that ruling authority could only be mustered and enforced through violent action. Violence in itself acted as an important tool to be used and abused as the Sith saw fit. Similarly, the Empire's entire structure built itself on holding a monopoly over violence that it could freely utilize against any perceived threat, enemy, or even undesirable. As for their second major commonality, the Sith pursued power at the expense of order, unity, and stability, placing their power base over any form of cooperation. By the same token, while the Empire looked extremely unified on the surface, the reality was the Imperial hierarchy was built on a similar principle of officers in the military pursuing power at the expense of any adherence to ideological purity or camaraderie. Of course, the irony is obvious. Sith ideology was in direct opposition to what the Galactic Empire claimed to promote. However, there was still a purpose to the Empire's unified qualities and their divided qualities as well. Beginning with the former, while any Sith would absolutely despise being subject to the kind of rigid order and collective-minded ideals of the Empire if subject to them, Palpatine capitalized on the fact that he wasn't subject to them. Instead, he took advantage of the fact that everyone else was. Unlike Sith empires of old, the Galactic Empire did not make ambitious pursuits of power the crux of its official ideals, which resulted in endless infighting. Instead, the Sith organized Imperial beliefs for one key reason. The Empire was not designed to create a stable civilization for the entire galaxy, but rather it was designed to create a stable throne for the Sith to reign over. However, there were gaps with this contradiction, and this was most prominent within the Moffs and military officers. It was commonplace for Imperials to undermine each other for the sake of earning power, glory, or the Emperor's favor. This degree of inward pursuit of power became so bad that entire internal organizations were in direct rivalry against each other, such as the Imperial Inquisitorius against the Imperial Security Bureau or the Imperial Army against the Imperial Navy. In many ways, the killing, framing, or discrediting of others could be framed as a non-force-wielding version of Sith ascendancy in the hierarchy from Sith empires of old. As a result, while the Galactic Empire was not fundamentally a Sith empire, Sith influence tethered the Empire's society to not be built on its claimed ideals of order, stability, and unity, but rather the simple ideal of might makes right. With all the major points covered above, this leaves us one final question. Was the Empire all bad? I am sorry to say to the Imperial apologists out there, but the short answer is yes. The fact of the matter is, while the Empire did do some good initially through providing a sense of structure, recovery, and even rooting out external corruptive forces that plagued both the Republic and Separatists during the Clone Wars, the fact remains that the Empire's atrocious actions, ranging from suppression to stripping of liberty, overtaxation for a military used against its own people, the normalization of discrimination against non-humans, the legalization and utilization of slavery and genocide of entire populations, and the complete lack of accountability made it a system built nearly out of contempt to the very people they were claiming to protect. That isn't to say the Empire didn't do any good during its reign. It did provide a semblance of order towards systems that were in chaos and ruled by crime. It brought about economic recovery from the Clone Wars, as well as paving the way for new jobs both within the military and economic sectors. It even did a decent job in rooting out or reining in external sources of corruption, such as pirates, crime lords, and megacorporations. I'll also be fair that human quality of life in the core did improve under the Empire compared to the Republic. However, even the bit of good it did was not only outweighed by the evils it did, but the good actions of the Empire were always rooted in achieving subservience rather than out of any kind of altruism. All of this, combined with Sith influence that only grew within Imperial politics, ultimately created a government structure that was self-contradictory and ultimately doomed to fail. Even in a scenario where the rebellion was defeated, it is my belief that the Empire would still face internal collapse, a fact that, if going by both Disney canon and Legends, was a scenario even Palpatine considered given his backup empires in the form of the Final Order from Disney canon or the Dark Empire from Legends. However, while the short answer to the overarching question is yes, the long answer is that it's complicated. In spite of the ocean of problems that the Empire faced that ultimately doomed it to oblivion, there were still many good or at least morally gray members of the Empire that did intend to fulfill the Empire's promise of safety to the galaxy. One of the most popular examples of this was none other than Grand Admiral Thrawn, who overcame the discrimination of the Empire's human high culture and served as an Imperial who, in spite of still being authoritarian, was practical in his reasoning and stood to attempt to make reforms over the galactic government. He was even successful in making drastic reforms during his brief reign over the Imperial remnant in Legends, such as when he reduced its human high culture, which provided aliens greater rights, including the ability to serve in the Imperial military. He also made the Imperial remnant less overbearing and had a stronger promotion of camaraderie, which was showcased both in his willingness to negotiate through encouraging officers to learn from their mistakes instead of instilling fear of failure with their lives. Ultimately, I do not believe the goals of Imperial ideals were evil in itself. It ultimately did try to create a safe, unified, and strong galaxy. Most members of the Empire did legitimately believe that its order, rigid, and firm structure would make a government pure from corruption and bring about prosperity for all galactic citizens. However, how these goals were allegedly pursued was evil. It ultimately came down to the fact that the Empire did not value its own people. All of its large-scale atrocities were justified by it for the greater good. It suppressed all manners of liberty because of the things liberty granted were seen as problematic. Alien species were treated poorly, and even faced slavery and genocide because they were framed as a danger to the galaxy. The galactic economy suffered in the long run because of its overspending with no consensus, and finally, the use of its military was effectively holding a blaster to everyone's head and calling it protection, resulting in it bringing about more war than peace. At the end of the day, in spite of all the fancy uniforms, the mesmerizing propaganda, the preachings of peace, and songs of unity, The Empire was little more than the Sith's playground, and it is not coincidence it died shortly after them. Well, ladies and gents, this concludes this analysis. I hope my answer was satisfying even if you did not quite agree with it. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and posting a comment below on what you think, as all of that promotes discussion and helps the channel grow. Was I dead on with my conclusion? Was I too hard on the Empire? Was I not hard enough on the Empire? Or am I just rebel scum? Until next time, I bid you all farewell. Peace out.